I never thought a simple game of hide-and-seek could change everything. That night, the abandoned park loomed like a giant sleeping monster, with rusty swings creaking in the wind and shadows engulfing every corner. Sarah, always the one to suggest crazy challenges, laughed loudly, declaring that this would be the most unforgettable game ever. And she was right. The memory of that night keeps replaying in my mind like an endless nightmare. The image of Sarah standing motionless in the playground, her lifeless eyes, and the chilling voice echoing from somewhere in the darkness, it's all etched deeply into my consciousness, impossible to erase. If I had known what was waiting for us, I would never have agreed to play. But now that it's over, one haunting question remains. Was it truly a game or a curse we accidentally unleashed? The biting cold enveloped us as Sarah, Mike, Tom, and I stood in front of the abandoned park's gates. Sarah was always the leader of our reckless adventures, and this time was no different. She suggested playing hide-and-seek here, and as usual, we couldn't say no. Sarah was chosen to count first. She covered her face with her hands and began counting. At first, her voice echoed enthusiastically across the park, setting the mood for the game. I sprinted deeper into the park, finding a hiding spot behind a crumbling wall. But when Sarah's count reached 15, something felt off. Her voice suddenly distorted, as though mixed with another sound, a strange alien whisper cutting through the night. I peeked out from my hiding spot, trying to spot Sarah. She stood completely still in the middle of the playground, her flashlight lying on the ground, its beam flickering eerily. The atmosphere grew heavy, the cold so suffocating that I could barely breathe. While I hesitated, uncertain whether to run or stay hidden, another voice began counting. Deeper, more menacing. 16, 17. A chill ran down my spine. Sarah began to move, her steps rigid, as if her body was no longer her own. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I had to run. Mike appeared out of nowhere, running toward me, gasping for breath. He looked terrified, his eyes locked on Sarah. I realized something was wrong too. Sarah was no longer herself. The two of us tried to escape her lifeless gaze, but the park transformed into a maze. Every path led us back to where Sarah stood, waiting as if she knew our every move. This time, I froze as Sarah pointed toward Tom. As soon as her hand dropped, Tom was pulled into the shadows. No scream, no trace. He vanished, as if he had never existed. Now it was just me and Sarah, but my best friend was no longer there. Instead, there was something else. Cold, alien, and unfeeling. I realized Sarah wasn't free anymore. She was completely under the control of something else. A mysterious entity emerged behind her, twisted and dark like the night itself. I tried to fight my fear, but the entity's voice cut through my thoughts, sharp and chilling. Sarah chose to play to save you, but she failed. Now it's your turn to choose. The entity's words hit me like a blow. I looked at Sarah, remembering her bright eyes and familiar smile. She had risked everything to save us, and now it was my turn to decide. I saw the faintest flicker of despair in her eyes, or what was left of them. I knew I couldn't abandon her, but saving her would mean sacrificing myself. I hurled myself at the entity, ignoring the terror clawing at my chest. I was ready to give up everything to set Sarah free. But as the blinding light consumed me, a horrifying truth was revealed. I wasn't dead, but I wasn't myself anymore. I looked down at my hands, where a strange darkness coiled around me. The entity's voice echoed one last time, cold and triumphant. You did exactly what I needed. A pure soul like yours is the perfect fuel to sustain this game forever. I realized I had fallen into its trap. Sarah couldn't be saved. She was already fully consumed by the game. And now, so was I. As the blinding light faded, I found myself standing in an empty, suffocating void. My body was intact, but I no longer felt like I belonged to the living world. The entity's voice mocked me one last time. Did you think you saved them? No, Anna. This is just a cycle. You can't save anyone. You're just another link in this endless chain, like all those before you. I didn't respond, but regret flooded through me. I had tried my best to do the right thing, but it turned out that right wasn't enough in this game. When I saw the images of my friends, Sarah, Mike, and Tom, trapped in endless darkness, I realized that this game wasn't about survival or winning. It was a test of courage, sacrifice, and above all, how we face our choices. I can't escape this game, but I understand one thing. The choices we make don't just affect us, they ripple out to others. One small mistake can lead to an unending tragedy. Though the entity won, I no longer fear it. I will stay here, waiting not to save myself, but to warn anyone daring to enter this cycle. If they must choose, at least, they'll know that sacrifice isn't always the answer. My name is James Wainwright, a man admired by society for my wealth and power. But deep down, I know that I am nothing more than an empty shell. Since Nathan, my son, died in a car accident 10 years ago, I have been living in a nightmare of my own making. It all began on a cold morning. A package was delivered to my house with no sender. Inside was a peculiar chessboard, intricately crafted from a white, ivory-like material, cold to the touch like human bones. Along with it was a short note. Do you wish to atone for your sins? Sit down and play. Each wrong move will take away what is most precious to you. I scoffed. Who would dare challenge me, a chess master? I couldn't have known. The moment I placed the first piece on the board, the air in the room turned icy. The lights flickered, and shadows began to pool around the chair opposite me. A figure emerged from the darkness. I froze. It was Nathan. My son, who had died in a car accident 10 years ago, now stood before me. His pale skin and black, hollow eyes sent a chill down my spine. He said nothing, merely sat down and began moving a pawn with his ghostly white hands. The game had begun. I lost a pawn on the first move. At that moment, a blood-curdling scream rang out from upstairs. I rushed to find Mary, my loyal housekeeper, hanging lifeless from the ceiling, her eyes wide open, her mouth twisted as if she'd been trying to scream. My heart stopped. I stumbled back to the living room, shaking. Nathan was still there, seated calmly, as if nothing had happened. This game doesn't just take pieces, he said coldly. Every wrong move will take the life of someone you love. I was terrified, but how could I stop? The deaths continued. My wife, the woman who had stood by me despite my flaws, was suffocated in her bedroom. My daughter, the pride of my life, vanished without a trace. Each death was a dagger to my heart, but I couldn't stop playing. Nathan's hollow eyes bore into me, deep and unrelenting like an abyss. By the final move, I was left with only my king. The game was no longer just a game. I realized that every piece I had lost represented a fragment of my sins. I stared at the chessboard, at my remaining king. Nathan spoke, his voice low and steady. You know what you must do. I don't want them all to die, but you must pay for what you've done. I will never forgive you, and you cannot forgive yourself either. I understood. I moved my king, placing it in a position for Nathan to end the game. But instead of delivering the final blow, the chessboard began to melt. The room shifted and warped around me. I was no longer seated. I stood in an endless void of darkness, facing myself, an ugly, distorted version of me. Nathan wasn't here to take revenge. He was the embodiment of the pain I had caused. That night, I had been drinking. I was the one behind the wheel that caused the crash that killed Nathan. And worse, I had fabricated a story to pin the blame on an innocent driver. You think I came back to forgive you? Nathan's voice whispered from the shadows. No, I'm here to make you face your guilt. You don't deserve peace. When I looked back, the horrifying truth struck me. I had never been the player. I was just a pawn. My selfishness, lies, and ambition had dictated every move on the board. Each decision was not mine to make, but a judgment passed by the sins of my life. The darkness engulfed me. I heard Nathan's laughter, mixed with the cries of my wife and daughter, echoing endlessly in my mind. Nathan appeared again in the void, but this time he was no longer the innocent child I remembered. He stood tall, a king sculpted from anguish and resentment, wearing a crown of blinding light. You think I just wanted you to suffer? Nathan's voice boomed with power and bitterness. No, this game was to end the cycle of guilt. You must sacrifice what is most precious to atone. I collapsed. I had nothing left. My family was gone. Everyone I loved was dead. But then I looked down and saw my king, the last piece, and I finally understood. What was most precious wasn't my wealth or power. It was myself. If you want my life, take it, I choked out, placing the king down. I have lived as a coward, but I will die as someone who takes responsibility. Nathan didn't reply. He only smiled, a sorrowful, knowing smile. Then he raised his hand and the darkness consumed me. I opened my eyes. I was no longer in my mansion. I stood in an empty white void. A disembodied voice echoed, "You have sacrificed yourself, but atonement does not mean release." The chessboard reappeared before me, but this time I wasn't sitting in the player's seat. I was one of the pieces, standing silently among the others, controlled by an unseen hand. I realized I was trapped in an eternal cycle. I would play this game over and over, not to win, but to continue facing my sins forever. I no longer screamed or resisted. I only stared at the chessboard, where the lives of those I loved had fallen because of my mistakes. Nathan was gone, but I knew he wasn't truly gone. He existed in my memories, in the pain that would never fade. My hell was not fire or demons. My hell was this endless existence, where I must face myself and never forget my sins. The chessboard never stops. The game never ends, and I am forever a pawn in my own game.